What will the future map of the world look like, and will it include nation states? We'll look at that next on Global Perspectives.
This program was made possible by funding from the UCF Global Perspectives Office.
Hello and welcome to the Global Perspective Show. I'm John Bersia, Special Assistant to the President for Global Perspectives at the University of Central Florida. Our guest today is Parag Khanna, author of The Second World and How to Run the World. Thank you for joining us today, Mr. Khanna.
Great to be with you, John.
Bold titles for your books, and maybe give us a sense of...
As long as the word world is in there.
As long as the word world is in there. Where are you going with these two books that have really captured the public's imagination?
Well, thanks. I mean, the first was an effort to capture structural change, the idea that we've moved much faster than anyone in America believed, from a unipolar world where America dominated, called the shots, to a multipolar world in which we really are competing with multiple other superpowers, particularly China and the European Union, but other major regional powers, India, Brazil, Russia, and so forth. To capture that very complex dynamic was the task of the first book, and I did it as a travel narrative, going around to all of the places where the great powers are competing for influence. This new book is about systems change, basically moving into a world not only of multiple powers. Yes, nothing has changed in that, but looking beyond those into non-state actors and groups, corporations, NGOs, philanthropists, terrorist groups, you name it. All of those players who really do have a lot of influence on the ground all over the world, but theories have not yet caught up to capture them. So there's a real logical sequence to the two books.
Good. Let's talk about the first one, especially in the context of what's happening right now in North Africa and the Middle East. You were one of the people who early on identified some likely developments in those and other places. How did you arrive at those conclusions?
That's right. You know, I mean, when I was the chapter on Egypt in The Second World says Egypt is ripe for revolution, and I was referring not just to Egypt but to the whole region. And I have chapters in that book on Morocco, on Libya, on Saudi Arabia, on Iraq, on Syria, you name it. All the Arab countries except Yemen actually has a chapter in that book. And you know, the common denominator is what I call post-colonial entropy, the idea that these countries have been fragmenting, or the conditions have been building up for them to collapse ever since they were born in the decolonization waves of the 1950s and 60s, because the populations have quadrupled, because there's been no investment in infrastructure, because of corrupt governance, because of a whole variety of reasons, and particularly a succession crisis that always happens in each of these countries. Is Gamal Mubarak going to take over from his father? Is Saif al-Gaddafi going to take over? In country after country after country, you find that the succession crisis is very often the tipping point that is needed to help spark a sort of revolution. So I feel, you know, vindicated. I also feel, more importantly, that the future is going to be better for the Arab world, having gotten rid of a lot of these leaders. Now, I'm not naive. You're not. You know very well that a lot of the institutions and the coterie of advisors and sort of, you know, backdoor type of people are still in charge in many ways, whether it's the military or secret police and so on. However, this is just the first step in a process of creating better, more accountable governments. And whoever comes after any given leader, whether it's the son or someone else, is never as powerful as the father was. So it becomes easier and easier to apply a lot of pressure to get them to reform and change.
Now, do you think that really significant change is inevitable in all of the countries you just mentioned, plus others, or are we going to see different experiences on a case-by-case basis?
Significant is difficult to define, but they will absolutely go in very different directions. This is not Eastern Europe after 1989. That's one of the most common analogies that is made. It's completely wrong, because in 1989, the Eastern European governments were all of one regime type, and there was one common external yoke holding them all in place. Those conditions have never been present in the Arab world, not since the Ottoman Empire, when they weren't independent to begin with, not even nominally so. So what we have now is a range of regimes, from tin pot dictatorships to theocratic monarchies and republican states. So very different kinds of government, all of which face different internal, external pressures. They will evolve in very different directions. Almost none of them will be democratic in the Western sense of the term. All of them, I believe, will become more accountable. all of them will face external pressures to reform their economies to compensate for the shock that they've taken now in the last few months. Even the quote unquote legitimate monarchies like Saudi Arabia, even though they can afford to bail themselves out and to suppress any opposition, they're talking about having a constitutional monarchy, creating a stronger parliament, all sorts of things. So every country in the region is going to have to experiment, but it will take them in different directions.
Yeah. And I agree with you 100% that this is very much unlike what happened in Eastern Europe at the end of the Cold War, except maybe in the general sense that it contributes to the overall mix of peace and security issues facing the world, and it often frustrates me when I hear people say, oh, well, the peace and security challenges are decreasing.
Right.
I would argue that they are increasing and have done so with each year following the end of the Cold War, ironically.
Yeah. There's a lot of there's a lot of sleight of hand and statistical games that people play to say the world has become more peaceful. Just look, the number of civil wars has fallen from an all-time high right after the end of the Cold War in the early 1990s, of course, Balkans, Central Africa, and so forth. And now there's very few civil wars. Or, the number of casualties in terrorist attacks has fallen in the last 10 years. I mean, all of these are just statistical tricks, to my mind. The number of latent conflicts, political, territorial, and otherwise, is still immense. And the volume of political violence that results from terrorism, organized crime, human trafficking, transnational sort of forces is absolutely extraordinary. So to think that, on the one hand, yes, quality of life in terms of average per capita incomes, level of development, access to medicines, these kinds of things on a worldwide basis, absolutely life has improved. That doesn't mean that politics is necessarily more stable in much of the world. Those are two different things. They are related, but one has not yet caused the other yet.
As these systems change and evolve, what is your personal standard as to what would be the ideal system of government that should emerge, or is that something you're still working on? And this is something else that often frustrates me, because people will say, oh, well, it needs to have a democratic system like ours, and this is still a work in progress here. It wasn't that long ago that we had restrictions based on ethnicity and gender, and our own Civil War wasn't that long ago either.
Yeah, exactly.
So
I try to tackle precisely that question on two levels in this book. The first is the domestic level. Should all regimes be democratic? And obviously, since the answer is they're not going to be anyway, what are we striving towards? And the neutral metric, or the neutral term, is good governance. So we talk less and less about democracy, we talk more and more about good governance. Good governance is a set of indicators around rule of law, around freedom of association, around respect for human rights, around public service delivery, efficiency, accountability of rule. And you notice I didn't use the word democracy. So good governance is gaining ground around the world as a sort of term. And again, you can quantify good governance better than you can quantify democracy. It's less controversial anyway. The second is at the global level, in answering that question. You can't really have democracy on the global level. I mean, there's no such thing as a global democratic government, right? One man, one vote. There's no global parliament. It's very hard to democratize international organizations, whether it's the United Nations or the World Bank. That's not what they were meant to do. They're technocratic kinds of agencies. What I'm looking for on the global level, though, is still a lot more responsiveness, whereby global resources, to the extent that they exist among either major powers or international organizations, to me, the test is, are those resources supporting local causes, local actors, local governance? The best example of that is regional peacekeeping forces. I don't want there to be any more United Nations peacekeepers. I'm very grateful that there are 100,000 United Nations peacekeepers currently serving in operations around the world. I think that in many cases they're doing a good job, and very often they get tormented and criticized because of bad mandates, which is not to say that they are bad in what they're doing. It's just that their mandates have been bad. But I want to see much more regional peacekeeping forces. So when you say, what is my yardstick? What am I looking for? I'm looking for stronger regional organizations, stronger regional peacekeeping mechanisms, stronger regional governance. So those are two different answers, but addressing the same question. What should societies look like, either at the national or international level?
Are there regions where you see those types of organizations really stepping up and playing a significant substantive role?
You know, you said a few minutes ago, this is just the beginning, and we've actually moved pretty far along in regionalism. This is this missing middle, meso level of international relations. You know, the European Union is obviously the gold standard. 27 members, true supranational entity economically and increasingly politically as well. Other regions are trying to catch up. ASEAN and the ASEAN Regional Forum are doing ever more internally in terms of diplomacy and peacekeeping issues and just transnational problem solving, environmental level. The Union of South American Nations has replaced Mercosur with Brazilian leadership. There you see a lot more internal activity within South America. Just 13 countries, a lot more trade, a lot more exchange, a lot more infrastructure, a lot more cross-border business activity, development projects, a lot of things going on. African Union, particularly on the peacekeeping side, and diplomacy as well, really trying to diffuse crises before they blow over. So I see region by region efforts to copy or to at least go down the path of this European model, the way Europe is done. Now, no other region may ever get there to the extent that Europe has, but the trends is actually very promising.
You referenced diplomacy, and this is something that you come back to quite often in your writing. How important is the diplomatic piece going forward?
Well, it isn't. There's no such thing as a separate diplomatic piece. Diplomacy is everything, and I think everyone needs to understand that. All of those negotiations, that whole context, deciding who's at the table, who's negotiating about what, is it the economic issues, the security issues, whatever it may be, diplomacy is that. There is no activity outside of diplomacy. So it's not just a piece, it is the whole. It is the whole, and everything is a part of that whole. So to understand diplomacy as the unifying web that really brings all of these activities together is essential to my work and to what I'm arguing.
As we're seeing the number of new systems increase, we're also seeing an increase in the number of countries in the world today. And some people believe that that could lead to fragmentation and perhaps problems long term. Do you see it in that way, or is this sort of a natural trend for the moment?
Yeah, I mean, by definition, right, more countries being born means more fragmentation, but what isn't captured on the map is, again, things like the European Union. I mean, look, we've got a lovely globe right here. It shows different countries. It doesn't capture the legal existence of the European Union, right? But the fact is that there is not only the splintering of states into new states, but there is this agglomeration of them joining together in terms of creating real cross-border interdependencies. Look at North America, Canada, the United States, Mexico. On the map, you would never see NAFTA or what some people are calling a North American Union. Look at the passage of trade across the three countries, the infrastructure that's going on, the interdependency, both in the positive and the negative sense, the drug trade and so forth, the volume of remittance flows, the demographic blending that's happening in North America, that's just not captured on the map, but it's very much happening, whatever label or acronym you put on it. So I very much think that the creation of new states may happen, but the next step beyond that is the step that we should be focused on as well, which is how do you get small, landlocked, poor countries to really fuse and partner with their neighbors so that they can be more productive, so that a region can be a whole that's greater than the sum of its parts.
As you approach your analysis of these developments, what is your goal? What is your framework? How does it all fit together for you?
Well, we talked earlier about structural change, meaning a multipolar world with a number of powerful states, but those are just 4 or 5 out of 200, right? And then systems change. All of these new actors, NGOs, corporations, and so forth, that aren't captured in our traditional models, bringing those together into a complex but interrelated reality in which the actions of one affect the other. So a corporation pulling out, an oil company pulling out of a poor country means that that economy is going to tank, and it could lead to instability, right? On the other hand, China's decisions to invest in a certain country are going to change the fortunes of an entire region as well. So capturing the reality of the interplay of companies, of NGOs, a terrorist attack in one place is obviously going to have big ripple effects, right? I mean, a fruit vendor in Tunisia lighting himself on fire is going to cause a chain reaction that's going to lead to NATO bombing Libya, right? Think about that. So my goal is to capture those inner relationships as much as possible, not through predicting everything. You know, we too often focus on who predicted something or didn't predict something. We really can't be blamed for not predicting certain things, but for not thinking through the scenarios of certain consequences, that I do think we need to do.
You and I have talked about Amy Chu on her book, Age of Empire. You've referenced several of the so-called rising powers. How do you view the rising powers? Are they strategic allies, strategic competitors? Are they potential military adversaries?
Right. Well, you know, I don't lump them all in one category, which I'm afraid quite a few people do, and I think that's highly problematic. And here's why. First of all, it's a U.S.-centric view to say, you know, are they our allies, are they competitors, and then to define whether or not they're good or bad based on that. And that's what happens with, say, China versus India. The fact is, they're both rising powers, and they're both important. China strategically is much more important in and of itself, not with respect to whether or not we care or don't care. So because I derive the rising power of these states from globalization, not from whether America likes it or doesn't like it. And those are two completely different approaches. The fact is that China is the most trade-dependent nation in the world. Its rise is not something that the United States sponsored by any stretch of the imagination. The United States supports India as an ally, but India's rise also began at a time when the US was very ambivalent about India. So the fact is that these countries, Brazil as well, Russia as well, have a relatively independent relationship to globalization. Now we are part of that globalization, but we are not the only power that shapes whether or not they rise. So I think that's a very important analytical distinction that has to be made. Now, do I view them as a challenge or a threat? I mean, they view us in a certain way as well. Some view us as an ally to be latched onto and to purchase weapons from so that they can build their own power. Hence, Saudi Arabia and India are doing this. Others view us as a threat. That's arming other neighbors to contain them. That's obviously the Chinese view. They also have a relationship to each other. Russia and China has been talked about as a future alliance, an anti-hegemonic, anti-American coalition. But in fact, Russia is more scared of China than it is of America. So again, the right way to view this evolving picture is much more neutral from a moral standpoint and much more neutral from a non-American standpoint, and say here is a set of powers that has an evolving set of relationships and dyads and connections among them, and none is truly superior to the others.
As you think about the future, and one of the things we enjoy doing here in our exercises is sort of brainstorming about what could happen in various places 5, 10 years from now, what do you think are the 2 or 3 most important short-term challenges for those living in the United States, since we are here, and also the 2 or 3 most important opportunities?
Right. Well, you know, fortunately, you know, for every challenge out there is an opportunity. In the next 5 years, I would say that America's industrial competitiveness is going to be a major one. And one of the great solutions to that actually is Latin America. Now, President Obama recently visited South America on a tour for 1 week that got a bit overshadowed by the headlines coming out of Japan and the Middle East, which is unfortunate. But what is great is that he did take the trip. He didn't cancel it. And what we can do with Latin America in terms of deepening joint ventures and economic partnerships with them is to really boost the competitiveness of the entire hemisphere, because Chinese labor is getting very expensive. Latin American labor is relatively becoming competitive. And so American investments in Latin American infrastructure can really yield output that could be competitive with Asia. So rather than outsourcing everything to Asia and building economic rivals and boosting our rivals, instead you bring it back home to the Western Hemisphere. That trend is starting to actually be underway. You see a number of companies relocating from China to Mexico, for example. Second, energy security. Again, amazingly, Latin America, which so many Americans ignore as a foreign policy priority, holds the solution. From the Arctic in North America and Canada and Mexico and the Gulf of Mexico, all the way down through Venezuela and Brazil, is all of the oil and gas and ethanol and other resources that America could really need for a very long time without ever being reliant on the Middle East. So when people say we need a new energy strategy, we need to diminish reliance on the Middle East, we need to make all these radical shifts, I say, look, I've got a 2-word answer for you: South America. And yet it's so hard to convince Americans that that should be a strategic priority. And yet it is on both issues, economic competitiveness and energy security. And what 2 issues do you hear people talking about more these days? Still, you see that Latin America is part of the solution.
We hear a lot about so-called rogue nations, and typically the response is the same. Isolation is a big part of the approach. What would you do with these rogue nations? Is it better to isolate them? Is it better to engage them? Or is there a third path?
Well, the first thing about rogue states is that we call them states of concern. We've stopped using the term rogue states, but we still know what we mean when we see it. And other countries certainly don't see it that way. But before I get to that, it's important to point out that there's fewer and fewer of them than before, right? Libya will gradually fall off that list as its civil war sort of conflict peters out. Eventually, North Korea, Myanmar, Uzbekistan, and so forth, Cuba, these regimes are going to fall. So there will be no countries left that are truly outside of the sphere of regular, ritualized global diplomacy and interaction, socialization in a way. So it's great to see that that is a secular trend. I think that that's very good. For those few places that are left, and the very controversial ones like Iran and North Korea, I see no alternative to engagement. People can talk about sanctions and isolation and this is our policy, meaning America. That doesn't mean that it works, because obviously Cuba and Iran, 30 years and 50 years going on, prove very well that our policy does not work. So first of all, everyone needs to understand perfectly clearly our sanctions policy, our isolation policy does not work. It's not a matter of tweaking it, because 50 years is enough evidence that it does not work. It has to be completely and totally scrapped. It has to be scrapped in favor of a real serious engagement. I mean economic engagement, diplomatic engagement, and yes, there's still sensitive issues. The Iranian nuclear program, of course, you need to have a nuclear track to the dialogue with them. You need to maybe even actively undermine that program. And yet at the same time say, but we're willing to open up an embassy here. We're willing to trade and invest. We will help modernize your petroleum infrastructure. We will give scholarships to students. Lots of things, all on the table, all going on at the same time. That is the best way to deal with these regimes. And that is the way in which you create a kind of new dynamic, that can help shake things up. We really don't know what our relations will look like with North Korea and Iran 2 years from now, 3 years from now, 4 years from now. I do know that they will look exactly the same unless we stir the pot a little bit. So I'm for stirring the pot.
To go back to the emerging systems, emerging nations discussion, you still have stateless population groups in the 21st century. How would you deal with that issue?
I think it's a very important issue. The size of diasporas, the number of migrants in the world is increasing tremendously. There are still long-standing, unresolved territorial disputes. People talk about globalization and the death of distance and so forth, but really territory still matters. Most of the world's people will never leave the country in which they were born, in fact. So rootedness still matters a lot. So if you take Kurdistan and Palestine, for example, I would create these states yesterday. Right, because I don't think that if your goal is holding Iraq together because we broke it, we own it, the sort of Pottery Barn, Colin Powell approach, it's still very shallow, quite frankly, quite short term for people to say, yes, we really need to hold Iraq together. I have no loyalty to the existence of the former Iraq. It's an artificial post-Ottoman sort of construction that fused together Sunni, Shia, Kurd, and others, and then Saddam Hussein held it together. We unleashed something with that invasion, right, by deposing Saddam Hussein. That is a process that is now going to organically continue to drift apart, and I think that's perfectly fine. Because I'm not thinking about the last 8 years since 2003. I'm thinking about the last 800 years, the last 3,000 years, that the Kurdish people have been really trapped between Arabs, between Persians, between Turks, and seeking their own territory and their own land, their own, now in the modern sense, statehood. And I think they should have it. And to me, resolving the Kurdistan dispute is going to solve a 3,000-year-old problem, whereas some people are saying, let's just sweep Iraq under the rug, let's just make it stable for a few years. I'm not interested in solving a short-term political objective. I'm interested in a smart policy. Smart policy is one that's going to create long-term regional stability. There will not be long-term regional stability until populations, stateless peoples, are satisfied, because they can agitate in a world in which they can get resources and get attention.
If you were in charge for a day, what one act or decision would you make that you feel would be truly significant in terms of the course of events for the world?
For the entire world, Well, I would,
from the U.S. perspective.
from the U.S. Well, okay. So I was going to give an answer around sort of canceling climate summits and focusing
that's
on
okay,
clean
that's
tech
okay,
innovation.
that's okay.
But the U.S. is not doing either, so it's almost a moot point. I would declare that Latin America is the third pillar of the West. When we talk about the West, we think of the West as being the transatlantic relationship, the United States and the EU, and then Africa, Latin America, those are marginal places. And the East is sort of like, China and India, and Russia is just kind of sandwiched in between. That's most people's mental, cultural map. To me, we need to declare and understand the West is three firm pillars. The European Union, which is a larger population and larger economy than the United States is. North America, which has us as the anchor, but is obviously very substantial and the true military superpower of the world. And South America, whose economy is the same size as China's, with a very large population as well, close to 1 billion people across Latin America, 600 million just in South America. And so we are the three pillars of the West, and that together, that can be an incredible force for stability in the world and a major driver of the global economy. That psychological sea change is needed with respect to understanding what the West is, because if that's how you understood the West, you would never say that China and the East are replacing the West. Never, not for 100 years, right? So I think that's a more accurate understanding of how the world is really unfolding.
Great. Thank you so much, Mr. Khanna, for joining us today.
Thanks, John.
And thank you. For the Global Perspective Show, I'm John Bersia. We'll see you next time.
This program was made possible by funding from the UCF Global Perspectives Office.